With all the excitement in the air regarding the development of Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Dread, it's really easy to forget how small this series actually is. It's historically never sold particularly well. The only game in the whole franchise to surpass 1 million sales in Japan was the original title, and the bestseller in the series, Metroid Prime, only surpassed 2 million, followed by the original game just slightly below it in total sales. Despite being around during the beginnings of Mario and The Legend of Zelda, Metroid always lacked the big push from Nintendo that the other two juggernauts had. When a fourth game in the series was released in 2002, Zelda and Mario had 10 mainline titles each under their belts. This story has been left without a follow-up for nearly 2 decades, and the franchise had to wait for 13 years to receive another 2D entry on the Nintendo 3DS. 4 years later, despite all odds, a Metroid game rumored to be in development years ago and hinted at in previous titles is revealed to be alive. Metroid as a series is in such a weird place. It's furiously adored by fans, has a legacy spanning 35 years, and its influences can be seen all over the current gaming landscape. But the series itself has struggled to pick up mainstream support over the years, and Nintendo has seemingly abandoned it several times. To describe this predicament as interesting would be an understatement. So that's why I think Metroid as a series deserves a full look. My Metroid journey began with Samus Returns in 2017, but my experience with the other titles is admittedly quite limited. I've loaded up Metroid, Super Metroid, and Fusion once or twice, but I've never gotten very far. So as I prepare for Metroid Dread, I think it's time I jump into the series more thoroughly myself, and share my thoughts and findings to hopefully drum up some interest for the franchise as a whole. And of course, there's only one place to start. The first game in the series, Metroid, for the Famicom Disk System. This is the original Japanese version that was stored on a floppy disk. Other than saving functionality and some slight sound differences, this version is nearly identical to America and Europe's NES counterparts. So, let's dive right in. The story of Metroid is quite simple. The game won't really give you more than 2 blocks of text, but thankfully the manual will fill in a lot of the details. In the distant, far-off year of 2000, representatives from various planets come together to form the Galactic Federation, and along with this new governing body, the Galactic Federation Police. However, the prosperity of the galaxy was under threat by space pirates, whose power and unorganized nature made them difficult to apprehend. In desperate need of help, the Federation called for warriors across the galaxy to assist in the apprehension of space pirates. Known as space hunters, these warriors were given hefty rewards for their work, and soon, bounty hunting became a way of living. However, in the year 20X5, a research station in deep space is raided by space pirates, and a newly discovered life form from the planet SR-388 is stolen. This life form, named Metroid by the researchers, was rumored to have been what wiped out the civilization of SR-388, and worse still, it could begin to multiply when exposed to beta rays. The Galactic Federation has located the space pirates' home base on the planet Zebes, but the Federation police are unable to take the planet. As a last resort, the Galactic Federation decides to send a single space hunter to infiltrate the space pirate fortress, eradicate the Metroid, and destroy Mother Brain, the leader of the space pirates. There's only one person for the job, Samus Aran, the greatest of all space hunters. Armed with her power suit, she enters the space pirate fortress alone, and thus our mission begins. It's not exactly a grand tapestry of a tale, but it lays the solid groundwork for the game and the sequels to follow. Metroid 1 establishes a lot of themes that the series will continue to use or expand upon, and it does this exceptionally well. It's really hard to give off the feeling of isolation or loneliness while also balancing the feeling of being a kick-ass one-woman army. And yet it's something Metroid 1 manages to nail. The soundtrack is a huge part of this. The music is so otherworldly and a bit unsettling, but the game also has these very quiet moments when entering rooms with new abilities. From a gameplay perspective, it's a quick indicator that something important is here, and you need to make sure you grab it. But it also manages to relieve a bit of tension, while giving off this mysterious vibe. What ability is hidden here? Who put them here? What do all these statues mean? Later games will even go on to twist this idea by throwing surprises at you in these supposedly safe power-up rooms. Atmosphere and Metroid are inseparable, and the game's music does such a marvelous job of creating that atmosphere, even on 8-bit hardware. Gameplay is pretty simple in Metroid. You control Samus, who is equipped with her signature blaster arm. You can run, jump, and fire. You'll gain a few more abilities as you progress, but the complexity doesn't increase greatly from there. You may need to crouch down to use the Morph Ball, or use Select to wield limited missiles, but the control scheme really doesn't change much. The typical gameplay loop consists of hunting around the map for upgrades and trekking back to previous areas to traverse new paths with the abilities you picked up. Every upgrade does a good job of granting access to some new areas across the map, changing combat slightly, or making new hidden items like extra health or missiles become available. Once you're well equipped, you can make your way to the mini-bosses in order to open up the final path to Mother Brain. Metroid's power-ups are quite the departure from similar games of the time. Sure, Zelda has its signature items, but you also have limited ammo and stopwatches that will temporarily freeze enemies. Mario, of course, has his time-limited superstars. Metroid instead has a very permanent progression system where you become stronger and more capable as you continue. It recontextualizes areas and enemies everywhere just by granting you a new attack or movement option. The Ice Beam turns every enemy into a possible platform, opening up all sorts of new locations and hidden items, but it also lets you freeze respawning enemies to stop the onslaught for a moment or stop tougher enemies in their tracks so you can escape and catch your breath. The Screw Attack makes traversal a breeze, and now you don't even need to stop and shoot to press onwards. The map or threats are rarely ever changing, instead you get more tools on your belt to handle them in different ways. There are some hints of Zelda design here, but they've been elevated to a new level. Earlier Zelda items tend to act more often as keys to various doors, whereas Metroid's upgrades function not just as keys, but new ways to fight and traverse the big interconnected world around you. I think Zelda would borrow these ideas more and more as the series progressed. Even Breath of the Wild's runes seem to function closer to me like Metroid's upgrades, compared to your typical Zelda bow or fire rod. It's a fantastic system, and I think that's pretty evident. It's created an entire genre, and there are elements of Metroid's design in a million other games, especially open world titles. The map design for Metroid 1 is also highly impressive. For the most part, it manages to keep a good balance between labyrinthian and straightforward. There's a single main path that splits into separate larger areas, so navigating to general locations isn't too taxing. But sometimes the way to progress in that area can be slightly obtuse. It definitely suffers from the old, completely hidden bombable wall trope that's so present in early adventure games, but by pulling up a map similar to later Metroid titles, it's much more manageable. Later worlds are much larger in scope and can be admittedly overwhelming, but Metroid managed to make its world feel massive while actually being surprisingly compact. It never takes too long to get around if you know where you're headed. The fact that many rooms are completely identical certainly makes that tougher though. I think this is particularly due to graphical limitations, but nonetheless it makes areas like the top of Norfair more of a chore to navigate. Despite this, it's still really well designed for the most part. From both a macro and micro scale, exploring Zebes is an exhilarating experience, and future titles will only continue to refine the open-ended overworlds the series is known for. These upgrades in the open-air map design are the very foundation of the Metroidvania genre. They're both excellent on their own, but in combination they've created such a marvelous formula that far surpasses the sum of its parts. A completely linear adventure game with permanent upgrades or an open-world exploration game with no new abilities may have some merits, but together they form such a divine experience few other games have managed to match. Not to mention the genre has had a huge impact on the industry as a whole. It's pretty well known that Metroid influenced Castlevania, but it also helped inspire Cave Story, which was a big catalyst in the boom of indie games we see today. Metroid as a series in the gaming industry just wouldn't be the same without the pioneer of design that is Metroid 1. And yet, it is really difficult to enjoy at times. I've never had an experience like this. By all accounts, Metroid 1 has some genius design. On paper, it should be a home run, but there are some slight issues that compound over a long playthrough into nearly insurmountable obstacles. The biggest issue is how punishing a game over can be. It feels like a death sentence to an entire run at times. You'll be sent back to the beginning of the area, which sure can be harsh at times, but the real devastating punishment is the fact that you'll spawn in with only 30 health, despite how many energy tanks you may have. Refilling these tanks only becomes more difficult as you gain more health, and sometimes I'd avoid energy tanks entirely just so I'd have an available full heal later on. There are these tubes that infinitely spawn enemies that sort of function as a way to regain health and missiles, but they are extremely flawed. You'll keep getting missiles even when you've reached your max, you'll only gain a measly 5 health when one spawns, and a single mistake will result in taking such a large amount of damage compared to what you regain. Restoring your health here isn't impossible, sure, but my god, it is such a mind-numbingly dull and excruciatingly long process. It really feels as though you have to conserve your health desperately, or route the game so you have enough energy tanks to refill your health before key moments or after a rough death. The screw attack is an absolute godsend in this game though, as jumping around in later rooms and grabbing the bigger health pickups can greatly increase your survivability. I've never been a huge screw attack fan until Metroid 1, but it is godlike here. I also don't particularly enjoy all the sprites for this game either. Don't get me wrong, the character design is sublime. The animations and the larger sprites like bosses are worth praising, but something about a few of the enemy sprites and even Samus's own in-game sprite just rubs me the wrong way. I think there's a reason you constantly see 8-bit Marios, Luigis, and Links, and not so much of Samus's blocky origins. It feels a bit silly to criticize the art of an NES game, but I do think these sprites have been done better elsewhere, even in 8 bits. While Samus has several weapons at her disposal, your options are frustratingly limited. You can't shoot diagonally, you can't shoot downwards, and you can't crouch. This makes some enemies or mini-bosses a huge pain. Even with the tiny zoomers are so frustrating to fight due to the fact that you typically can't hit them without bombs. I think Kraid may be the worst example though. Okay, so Kraid fires 3 spikes towards you no matter which side you're on, and these things come at you ceaselessly. However, with the Ice Beam, you can freeze the spikes in the air to prevent him from regrowing them. But you can only shoot one of them, since your standing position only lines up with a single spike. You may be able to make a tricky shot to get the upper spike, but the lower one is simply impossible. So Kraid ends up being a crushing boss fight where you're simply spamming missiles and praying you can outgun him before he sends you back to the start with a measly 30 health. Ridley suffers much less from this problem, although it does still feel a bit like a DPS competition instead of a true skillful fight. I think Mother Brain comes closest to a good boss fight, but it also has some issues. Having to blast missiles to make a path while navigating a bullet hell of projectiles and enemies is difficult enough, but then you have to hope and pray you have enough missiles and health left at the end to survive and take her out. It is by no means an easy fight, but it does come the closest to a true test of your mastery of the game's mechanics. The final escape sequence is a cool surprise if you don't know it's coming, but it's not too difficult either. And thus ends Metroid. It's a brilliantly designed adventure with just a few little pitfalls that completely bring down the experience for me. I'm certain if some of these issues were addressed with quality of life features, it would absolutely be worth running through again and again. I know it'd be great with these updates because that's exactly what they did with the release of Metroid Zero Mission. It adds multiple directions for aiming, crouching, adds health recharge stations, save checkpoints, a detailed map, and improves the Kraid and Ridley fights. And with these changes, Metroid 1 easily becomes one of my favorite experiences in the entire series. But that's a deep dive for another day. So is Metroid even worth your time? That's a hard question to answer. I certainly wouldn't recommend popping the cartridge into an NES and running through it blind, but with a detailed map and maybe some rewind or save states to help the medicine go down, sure. Maybe load it up on the NES Online app or the Virtual Console and give it a go. But if you're really interested in the definitive Metroid 1 experience, Metroid Zero Mission is really hard to beat. Considering how poorly some of the aspects of this game have aged, it's easy to take a glance at its portable 8-bit sequel and write it off as another unfortunately outdated experience. But counting out Metroid 2 Return of Samus would be a mistake. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye.